Tusen tack. Unar Olafsdotter is a friend of our family's, and we're so glad that she was able to offer the opening prayer in Icelandic, and warmed my heart. I'm grateful for her. Also, I wanted to have Friedrich Gudmundsson, if he'll stand, and Darren Allred, if you would please. These two gentlemen, this was a team effort, helped with translations throughout this text that's coming out December 1st by BYU Religious Studies Center, as well as it'll come out in Icelandic next year from the University of Iceland, their university press. And so anyway, I'm grateful. Anything that I am that's good has been a team effort with several people that have blessed my life, including, as David McCullough said, that his wife was his editor-in-chief. And I just like my wife to stand if she would. She's my editor-in-chief, and she is a wonderful person that's been such a blessing to me on this project and several others. In fact, she was the one that in February of 2000, she was reading the newspaper, and she said, "Honey, I think you're supposed to be involved in this project." Well, 5.5 years later, I am still involved in that project, and it's been a wonderful experience to associate with the great people of Iceland. As I was sitting here listening to Corey, and I appreciate his generous introduction, I appreciate him, and also working with Emily here with the center, I was thinking of Nephi, seeing in vision. In 1 Nephi 14:12, Nephi says, "I beheld the church of the Lamb of God, and its numbers were few." And he talks about how the saints of God were upon all the face of the earth. He goes on to say that the power of God rested upon the covenant people of the Lord, and how they were armed with righteousness and with the power of God in great glory. One of the wonderful things in being involved with international studies is that you truly do see, as you travel, the hand of God. And in 600 BC, Nephi saw in vision, I believe, many countries. We're in 143 countries now. And it's just marvelous. Joseph Smith, if you'll remember back in 1834 in Kirtland, he told the few of the brethren assembled that you know no more about the destiny of this church than a babe upon its mother's lap. He also went on to say that we should not let one corner of the earth go without the preaching of the gospel. And so, anyway, I wanted to just say, in visiting Iceland several times with my wife, even though there's not many saints, about 150 saints there now, they are mighty in spirit, and they are true pioneers that radiate the love of Jesus Christ. And it's been very humbling working with them and feeling of their goodness. So my presentation today, Fire on Ice, the story of Icelandic Latter-day Saints at home and abroad, is the story of their faith and their goodness. And the dedication in the book, as you see here, it's dedicated to my Icelandic friends at home and abroad, and to the memory of those who have crossed the ocean to carry the message of the restored gospel to the land of fire and ice, as an everlasting testimony that the great husbandman surely remembers those who are upon the isles of the sea. And anyway, I've been involved now for 10 years with doing research. What I do is Mormon maritime migration. And so I spent a couple of years on a sabbatical doing the Mormon Immigration Index that some of you may have used, that's in family history centers with a team of good people. And so I began to be interested in the church internationally. And as you can see, this isn't a great map, but various pockets of the saints. This is just showing the different routes they're coming and gathering to Zion. Most are actually coming from Great Britain. About 55,000 of the saints came from Great Britain, about 25,000 Scandinavians in the 19th century. And then a small percentage of those saints came from Iceland. And so I want to just talk about that story today, their interesting story of gathering. It's most appropriate, it's very timely that we would be talking about it this year, because this is not only the 150th anniversary of the first Icelanders to immigrate permanently to America, but it's the sesquicentennial of the Latter-day Saints coming to Utah. It's the same group. The first Icelanders to immigrate to America were in fact Latter-day Saints, and they came in 1855. and they came into Spanish Fork in fall. So this is, if there was ever a time that would be appropriate, it would be right now, as those first few came. They came on ships like this. This is the ship Camoens that was used in the 1880s to bring Latter-day Saints to Zion. And I think this is a wonderful image here, that courtesy of the National Museum of Iceland. One of the questions we need to respond to today is, how did Mormonism come to Iceland? And we can't really answer that question appropriately without talking about Gudmundur Gudmundsson, who was one of the first two missionaries to Iceland. And there's an article in BYU Studies that I wrote in 2000, if you're interested in reading more about his life, that I'm just going to touch on for sake of time. I figure that if we do 10 minutes a page in the book every minute, we will finish at 10 of. So I'm just going to give you a few highlights today, and I'm delighted that you would come today. So 1851, this is what happens. This is Gudmundur, and like other Icelandic youth, at age 19, he left his native land to learn the skills of goldsmithing. There were various crafts being learned in Copenhagen. So after 4 years, he passed his journeyman's exam, and then he worked for a time in Denmark. And in his own words, he said, "I lodged with a good friend of mine, Bjrnsen, who had recently become a journeyman cabinet maker. He was the first who talked to me about the wonderful sect called the Mormons. I promised I would come and hear them, which I did that following Sabbath. Brother Erastus Snow spoke, even though his preaching was very hard to understand because he still wasn't perfect in the Danish language. His honest face radiated a fatherly love which made a deep impression on me." Now, Thorin Havlidsen was the other. He was the other missionary that, these were the first two, that brought the gospel to the land of fire and ice. As we read here, in a letter to Elder Richards in 1851, Elder Erastus Snow, an apostle and also the Scandinavian mission president, said, "In the spring, 3 Icelanders who had embraced the faith in Copenhagen returned to their native land with the Book of Mormon and pamphlets, 2 of whom I ordained and commanded them to labor among their people as the Lord opened their way." So Vestman Eyre, or the Westman Islands, is where they went. This is just off the coast of Reykjavik. Okay, it is not large. At this time, not many people were populating it, several hundred in this one area, and then later we have about 5,000 today. This is what he said in his own words, Gudmundur Gudmundsson. "I expected that every person would believe a message so desirable. I had felt that the fruit of the gospel was more sweet and desirable than any other fruit, and I wished first and foremost that my relatives would partake of it. But alas, Laman and Lemuel would not. I preached to my brothers and sisters, but they would not receive me, and my pious parents had died, and I felt alone, like Elias of old in the cave. Yet a short time after I found some friends that were believing and continued to be faithful, though the laws were hard against us, and so were the priests and the reports of the press. I was often rebuked and spit on and mocked, but I was full of the love of God. I did not feel the least anger of indignation against any being." Now, you need to keep in mind, President Bjrnsen, some of you know, came to our campus in June, and as part of the sesquicentennial celebration. What a delightful man, the president of Iceland. And he made a couple comments here on campus that I thought were intriguing, and that is, he said, "You've got to understand, this was the first religious rebellion we'd had in hundreds of years. I mean, everybody was Lutheran, in other words, and then you have these Mormons that come around the corner." And he said, the other thing you need to remember is that at this time, in the 19th century, the Icelanders wanted to fight for their independence. They wanted to fight those Danes off that had been ruling over them for hundreds of years. And so it really wasn't a popular thing, one, to join anything but the state religion, which was Lutheranism. And two, he mentioned that if you're going to leave, when there's only so many men in the country and you're going to leave us to do the fighting, so to speak, it wasn't so popular. So I want to emphasize it really wouldn't have mattered what other religion it was at the time. It would have not have been something that was viewed as being a popular thing to do. Anyway, Gudmundur and Thorin begin to preach the gospel. Local papers, though, begin to publish false reports about the Mormons. Religious leaders warned the people not to listen to these missionaries, whom they called false prophets, who had come to deceive their countrymen, trying to protect their Lutheran faith. Another blow came to the work, though, when Thorin's own wife, who was strongly opposed the conversion of her husband, and also her mother, I might add, she just burned his literature up, his Mormon literature. And she became desperate. She wanted him to have nothing to do with this, and so she threatened to drown herself. And Thorin thereupon ceased to do missionary work, but he tried to remain faithful. Ironically, in December the same year, it was not his distraught wife who drowned, but rather Thorin himself, who lost his life in a fishing accident. Gudmundur informed Copenhagen of this tragic event. That was the mission headquarters in Scandinavia, noting that 24 people on the island desired baptism. This is still in Vestmannaeyjar, the Westman Islands, off the coast of Reykjavik. But no one was by the way, this is less than 1% of the landmass of Iceland. It's about 40,000 square miles. But no one was authorized to perform the ordinance. Now, this is fascinating to me because when Erastus Snow set apart Thorin and also Gudmundur the priesthood, he thought that Gudmundur was so zealous, and he thought he would just ordain him to be a teacher, but ordained Thorin to be a priest, okay? Kind of keep things in check. But as he was as he went to do it, he had the impression that he should have ordained him also a priest and not a teacher, which he would regret later when Thorin drowned, and they had to wait quite a while before another missionary could come and perform these ordinances. Finally, in April of 53, Gudmundur receives a companion who was John Lawrenson. So he's grateful to receive this companion. They've waited some time. In June of 53, Lawrenson organizes the first branch of the church on the Westman Islands, consisting of 6 members and Elder Gudmundsson as the branch president. Now, what's also intriguing is that after serving a mission here in Iceland, he decided that before going to Zion, he would go back to Denmark and serve a mission there. But he ran into problems. He was arrested for preaching the gospel there, incarcerated for 7 weeks in prison, and then upon his release, he was forced into the Copenhagen military, into service with the Danish military service. And then after a difficult term of service in which he was the victim of ridicule and scorn for his religious beliefs, he was finally discharged from the military, being found unfit for service due to poor lungs, which he knew he was healthy, but he writes in his journal that he felt like it was providential that they would view him as having this problem when he knew he was very, very healthy. So he goes to Salt Lake City. He went to Zion, and on one of these many voyages that came, he actually worked his way over as a cook. For those of you that are diehard family historians and you're looking for your immigrants and you're wondering what ship they came on, I'll give you a tip. And that is that the reason why you don't find them on these passenger lists, if you're looking, for example, in the Mormon Immigration Index, is because if they didn't go as a passenger, and they might be listed as a crew member if they went like as a cook, or if they were short on sailors or something, and you're wondering where are they? Well, it may be that they simply went over like Gudmundur and worked his way across. Now, even though he came in 57, he's not the first, though, Icelander to come to America, a Latter-day Saint. Samuel and Margaret Bjrnsen, along with Helga Jonsdottir, they left the Westman Islands in 54 for Liverpool. And eventually, in January 55, they would embark. See, the gathering place for the saints in the 19th century was Liverpool. Okay, over 85% of the international voyages to Zion were from Liverpool. This was not only the best place for to launching from because of the rail and sail setup, so to speak, but it also was where the British and European mission headquarters was. So it was ideal. We have over 500 voyages of Latter-day Saints launched from Liverpool. It's fascinating to me in doing immigration research that we do not have a record of one single voyage of carrying Latter-day Saints that ever sunk crossing the Atlantic. And yet between 1847 and 1853 alone, we know of at least 59 non-Latter-day Saint voyages coming to Zion that sunk. And if you get into the Mormon Immigration Index CD that you can buy from the church distribution for only $6, there's over 1,000 first-person accounts typed word for word. You can do a word search for something like storm. And what you're going to find is as they made their way by sail, rail, and trail to Zion, you're going to see different miracles occur. For example, they'll get in a raging storm and think they're going to end up at the bottom of the Atlantic, and you'll have a young man come out on deck and put his right arm to the square. You can picture him sopping wet with the wind blowing, and then in the name of Jesus Christ rebuking the winds and the waves and prophesying that they'll come safely to shore. So it's interesting. In fact, my point, if I don't make any other point today, other than the Icelanders are great, and I'm grateful for their wonderful faith, it is that we have missed the boat. That is that we talk over and over again about wagons and handcarts design. We'll do the same thing. In 97, it was wonderful. Sesquicentennial of the saints coming to Salt Lake. Did we ever hear about crossing the ocean? No. Did 90% of the people that came to Zion cross by water? Yes. Did we miss the boat? Kind of. So my point is sometimes we have a cultural myopia that blurs our vision concerning who's a real pioneer. In fact, the DUP that have done wonderful things, they cut off who's a real pioneer after 1869 when the Transcontinental Railroad came into play. Okay? But the point I want to make is that there were incredible things. If you think it was hard to walk to Zion or to go by handcart or by wagon, try crossing the Atlantic in the time of storm with waves mountains high, okay? So I invite you to look at those accounts and to see the wonderful, inspiring story of the sail before the trail and of Latter-day Saints, the Europeans that came and made their way to Zion, notwithstanding the difficulty of the trek. In fact, in 1855, we have one immigrant saying, her name was Jane C. Robinson Henley. She said, notwithstanding the difficulty of the journey, with the fire of Israel's God burning in my bosom, I forsook my home for the gospel's sake. Well, it's in that same year that these first Icelanders come to Zion. Samuel Bjrnsen is actually he is the great-grandfather of Richard Williams, who's our associate academic vice president here at BYU. And anyway, this is, according to tradition, I wanted to mention, President Brigham Young directed these Icelanders to move to Spanish Fork, feeling they would fit in well with the Danes. But when I got into my research, I realized there was not one single Danish person ever attested being in Spanish Fork. They started coming in 1856. In fact, if you look at the early records in the area. So I think what happened is that when they came to the area, yes, they probably met with Brigham Young, and he probably said, you know what? We've got Spanish Fork settlement that just opened up, and it did just open up in 1855. And then I think as the story was, gets the water, goes the end of the row, someone added their own personal opinion. But so far, we can't find any Danes in that area in 1855. So that is something that I tried to clarify. The footnote is about 1 to 2 pages, single space, just on that one little point. Anyway, so this is important that these three were not only the first Latter-day Saint Icelanders to gather to Utah, but also the first Icelanders to immigrate to America. They paved the way for others. It's estimated that about 410 Icelanders immigrated to Utah. Most of them were Latter-day Saints. However, a few waited and were baptized once they reached the area. And they did go to Spanish Fork, okay? The groups coming in, Gudmundsson is an exception with his trade that he was with, and he ended up in Lehigh and a few other places, Draper. But for the most part, they all are going to Spanish Fork, and then a few went to Cleveland later and made their way up into Canada. So it's estimated about 410 between 1854, that's leaving the country, coming in 55, and then the outbreak of the World War I. But this represents only a small fragment of the Scandinavian saints who gathered to Utah during this period. Now here's another one that's very important to learn about, Thorstein Didriksson. Because not only is he important in assimilation, and it's wonderful to see how these Latter-day Saints take care of each other, okay? They're going to Spanish Fork, they're going to help each other out, and people like Didriksson, as you see here, is known for his hospitality, Bishop Didriksson, and he's also one that will write an important missionary tract that will be used for the conversion of many Icelanders later in the 19th century. We know in 57, so you get this first group, and then in 57 we know of 11 more that came, and then no records of Icelandic immigrants immigrated between 58 and 72, nor were any missionaries sent to Iceland until the arrival of Magnus Bjrnsen and Loftur Jonsson in 1873. Now, one of the wonderful things we found through our research is Friedrich Gudmundsson, who I mentioned was one of my translators. He was over in Reykjavik working at the National Archives there. We were trying to identify things together over there, and then he stayed for a time where his family lives and worked at the National Library there in Reykjavik. And we found these letters that were going, this correspondence of going back and forth between people that had come to Spanish Fork and now they're writing back to their loved ones. Two of those were Loftur Jonsson and Vigdis Bjornsdottir, Aunt Vicky she was called, or Wiki. And you can see a little background. She had this medical background, and so she delivered hundreds of babies, greatly loved, as was Loftur Jonsson. But these letters, they really want to emphasize, as they're writing back to their homeland, of how great it was in Utah, wanting them also to come, whether they were member or non-member. For example, you see Loftur Jonsson saying to Palt Sigurdsson, "We are doing very well. We live here peacefully and quietly, while others here in America, that is to say the United States, kill and destroy one another." So these letters are not only important to understand what's going on with Icelanders, but also what's going on in Utah during what period? The Civil War, right? And so this is, they're just absolutely treasures. Another letter. All of the Icelanders live in this little town, all of good health and prosper both spiritually and temporally. The wild Indians are rather restless at this time, which has led, should be, to them stealing cattle, so we sought to retrieve it from them, which did not go well. A few of the men, both white and Indian, were killed. Okay? Now this is a whole different, you got to understand that the cultural ramifications of Icelanders coming to America, especially during the time of the Civil War. And you should understand that for all Europeans, they feared during the Civil War, actually, this is another side note, they feared when they came across, the soldiers more than they did the Native Americans, right, trying to come through. Can you imagine coming through Missouri during the time of the Civil War? The extermination order was still in effect until 1976, right? They're searching them for gunpowder. They're trying to steal the Scandinavian women. They're pinning a button on a man for $1 a head, forcing him into the military in St. Joe, Missouri. As they're coming across this Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad during the Civil War, they're running, cannonballs are being shot over their heads. When they get to Fort Bridger, they're being made to swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. I mean, you talk about a great documentary. This one, I just need $1.5 million and I could do it. That's a little commercial there. Anyway, Christmas. Jonsson writes, "I'm a widower. My wife's died." And he goes on to say, "I wish that one woman from Iceland was here with me to take her place and dispel my sorrow. For though there be here many girls and unmarried women, I find that they do not suit me, as well as one from my own fatherland." I just love that. And here we have Vigdis Bjornsdottir, who's writing to a friend saying, again, wanting her to know that she's doing well, things are great here, and always dangling the carrot to come and join us. "By God's grace, I am well and have remained so since I came to these valleys, which was early in September of 1859, and was well greeted by my brethren Thordor and Samuel, who were here before me. Nevertheless, after my arrival, I lay sick for 3 months and had good nurses, particularly Thordor and his wife Hilga. I have 50 chickens, and we have eggs both to eat and sell. A dozen eggs cost 60 shillings. Butter is also at a very high price. At times, the pound is at 9 marks. There are 4 stores in this town." Well, this is wonderful for Utah historians going in. And for example, Leonard Arrington would have enjoyed this, a great economic Latter-day Saint historian, trying to figure out what life is really like during this time period. And here is an image of her in 19th century, Vigdis Bjornsdottir. She goes on to say, "Towns are organized in a way that some streets lay from east to west and others lay across the north and south." And she describes going down saying, "I am happy and well contented to have traveled from my fatherland, for the faith that I gained that the pure gospel was revealed to the prophet Joseph Smith in the latter days, and I know with a perfect knowledge that I am not being fooled by men." So these letters are circulating back. They're having an impact. Okay, we see this also with British saints as well. Now, I mentioned Magnus Bjrnsen earlier. Bjrnsen and Loftur Jonsson were the first of 23 missionaries in Iceland, including 21 native Icelanders who immigrated to Utah and later served missions. They launched the second and largest wave of Latter-day Saint Icelandic immigration to Utah, which subsides at the turn of the century, as I said. This was at a time of mass immigration from Iceland as a whole. The weather was they were having great difficulties, the farmers and things. And so this is quite large to think that from 1872 to 1900, we have about 16,000 out of a total population of 70,000 that are immigrating mostly to North America. And after 1900, very few are immigrating. So as we move into 1873, we see these first missionaries now coming back. They've immigrated to Spanish Fork. They're going back to teach the men and women of their homeland. However, because of the stronghold of the Lutheran clergy, they're running into problems. For example, Bjrnsen says, "We were called into court 3 times, but after being submitted to a rigid examination, we were again set at liberty." By the time the missionaries leave the Westman Islands a year later, a branch has been established. 11 Icelanders had caught the spirit of the message, and they will gather. And just 3 years after he returned to Spanish Fork, we're going back now to Thorstein Bjrnsen. He writes this missionary tract that has a tremendous impact. It's used over and over again. In fact, when the mission was reopened, it was closed from World War I in 1914, reopened in 1975, 6 decades later, okay? They used the same missionary tract that they had used in the 19th century, that this Thorstein Bjrnsen had written. That's unusual. Well, the Book of Mormon hadn't been translated in Icelandic, right? It wasn't available for sale until 1981. And so during that first mission, this is what they used. You also see an idea. They're mostly doing missionary on the Westman Islands, and then they come into the mainland. And here we have in 1880, John Eidvidsson mentions baptizing 3 people in Reykjavik, the first known baptisms in the capital city. He writes, "When the report spread about the baptism of these 3 sisters, the spirit of persecution was fiercely displayed by the people, and we were in danger of the mobs. But they still found success. They moved on. They bring back converts, 22 converts. The 1880s is the peak of immigration to Utah from Iceland of these converts, 1886 being the high point there. Now, one of the intriguing things we found through these letters is we found that one of the women baptized, one of these 3 that caused such a ruckus, her name's Sigurður, she was the wife of a Reykjavik police officer named Thorstein Jonsson. And what's really neat is that we have his companion in the police force, that these 2 are witnesses against the missionaries, okay? Well, one of them immigrates, joins the church, his wife does, then he joins the church, immigrates to Spanish Fork, and then he writes back a series of many letters to the other police officer trying to get him to convert to Mormonism and come join him in Utah. This is a very, very nice set of these accounts that gives us a feel of what's happening at the time. This Bishop John Helgason, you get a feel for this particular individual who writes a description of this police officer, Thorstein, saying, "He was a mighty man to behold and very diligent, but he was caught in the snares of Mormon missionaries which came here and became a Mormon." Same thing with Martin Harris. If you read the early New York newspapers, he was a great guy, farmer in the area, well respected, until he got involved with that Joe Smith, right? And then he became a scoundrel. Okay, same thing that we see here. So you have these letters going back from Thorstein to his fellow officer, Jon. "Everyone," for example, he says, "has been good to us. My Sigurður," this is his wife, "worked for a week harvesting potatoes." He says, "I'm much better off." This is a theme over and over again, saying, "I'm much better off," whether to family or friends, because they want them to join them in Zion. "I'm much better off and am more at peace walking these streets than I was in Reykjavik, and I have stopped longing to be back in Iceland again." He also mentions, "I would advise all not to trifle with the Mormons. All who have done so are somehow marked with bad luck." Okay, and you think about some of the times that they've been persecuting them or prosecuting them. In another letter he writes, "I'm currently trying to make a cowshed, which is called a corral here, out of boards. No one is punished for leaving the Mormons undisturbed, and there are a few examples for that. But it is up to everyone to accept the faith they wish to do so, if they wish to do so. Although I would recommend to anyone the study of the Holy Scriptures and ask God unceasingly and of a sincere heart, and it will be given him." Now he gives kind of an outline of what is going on, a theater, a church, a mill. Anyway, interesting stuff. About 150 Icelanders in 1888. By this time, they start moving into different pockets like Cleveland, okay, down in Schofield, which is a distance off. Most Icelandic converts enjoyed their Spanish Fork Zionic haven, In 1881, a ray of sunshine showed on the Icelandic saints when Icelander Bjrnsen translated the first chapter of the Book of Mormon into Icelandic. And yet missionary work in Iceland during the late 19th century continued to be very difficult. Probably a number of you have served missions internationally. Every country has its unique challenges. One of the challenges, though, in Iceland at this time, as we read from Thorstein Bjrnsen, he says, I'm traveling on foot. And this is in 1894, keep in mind, except when I have a guide to take me across the rivers and through unknown places. Once in crossing a large river on a ferry boat, we became fast in an ice floe, which threatened to drive us into the sea. The breakers were very dangerous and would certainly have upset the boat if we had been taken a little farther out. We barely escaped by throwing a rope to those people who were standing on shore, who caught it and kept from going farther. Okay? So most of the missionary work is going on the western coast of Iceland in Reykjavik, also in the Westman Islands. Very difficult to travel across the country. And another challenge Halldór Jónssen's going to tell us is that in his account here in the summer months, when the Icelanders were too busy working to stop and listen, he stated nearly all the people are engaged for 2 months from daylight to dark in haymaking. Well, during the time of that I've been there in June a couple times, you'll have the daylight, you'll see the sun up about 21 hours of the day. And in the wintertime, of course, there's just a few hours. So this is one of the challenges that were presented here. At the turn of the century, you have some of the saints that are immigrating over to Raymond, Alberta. And we also have those coming from Spanish Fork. The Schofield mine disaster will really have an impact on driving some of the saints in that area farther north. World War I, in 1914, as I mentioned, the mission will be closed down. And it won't be until 1965 that we have a branch of the church in Keflavik because of our servicemen there. It would be yet another decade before the mission would be reopened. And it was reopened by Byron Gislason. He and his wife, his beloved wife Melva, they served 3 missions there. And the first one that they served when they were asked by the brethren to reopen the mission in 1975 is most unique, because how many of you have ever heard of missionaries serving a mission for 4 years in a row in modern times? This is very unusual. Both these twins were just coming back from missions in Korea and Japan. The parents were saying, we'd love to serve a mission, but our boys are just coming home. President Kimball said, I think I can fix that, and simply called them on a mission. And so these boys ended up serving a 4-year mission, had a few weeks of a break in between, joined their parents. Here he is, a native Icelander, and his beautiful family. Boy, are they loved in Iceland even today. Byron died, I think, 2 years ago, and I had the opportunity to interview him before he died. I've interviewed his wife and the twins several times, but these are the folks that opened it up. Then Elder Worthland came in 1977 and dedicated the land. I invoke thy blessings upon the government, and I believe that has taken place. And it's interesting because Elder Joseph E. Worthland, President Bjrnsen, President Hinckley, and President Bjrnsen, they are good friends. They like it. They love each other and they like each other, and there's a wonderful association. I also wanted to show you in modern times Sveinbjörg Gudmundsdóttir, who translated all but the book of Alma into Icelandic, which was published in 1981. She was a mighty convert. She is in her elderly years now, still full of the fire of faith. She's been a seminary teacher I don't know how many times, but she still fires the saints up in Iceland now, and her conversion story is a real treasure. Some of you know Thor Leifson, who was appointed to the first honorary council in the U.S. In relation to Iceland, or some of you know Clark Thorstein, who also had that assignment in 1995. These gentlemen, working in the true spirit of the Kennedy Center, as far as this idea of being ambassadors to internationally, did a terrific job of rekindling a bridge that President Bjrnsen talked about when he came here for the sesquicentennial celebration in June, and of brotherhood that now it extends beyond the ocean, and we're now able to join hands. So they invited ambassadors to come during this last decade that have come. They hosted, for example, Jon Baldvin Hannibalsson, who came and met the first presidency. Others have also come. We've also had tours that have gone on since this last decade, led by Lil Shepherd, who at one time was the president of the Icelandic Association of Utah. Again, not mighty in number, but I know of no group of Latter-day Saints that have immigrated from abroad that are closer as a unit and that meet every year. They've been having Iceland Days since 1897. Isn't that wonderful? They're a wonderful group of people, and when you get around them, you feel the Spirit of the Lord Jesus Christ. We had Mark Gesslison, some of you know, that brought over his music group over, and they just loved it. President Bjrnsen came in 1997. A friendship was established. Seeds were cultivated, and there's this wonderful friendship that goes on today. Here's President Bjrnsen and his wife, David Ashby, a very key player in the Icelandic Association, and Lil Shepherdson. On June 30th of 2000, a cluster of Icelandic saints from Utah and church members from Iceland met to celebrate the erection of a monument on the Westman Islands, which lists the names of 410 Icelanders who had immigrated from Iceland to Utah between 1954 and 1914, most of whom are from the Westman Islands. That's another thing so unique. Out of that 410 that immigrated, half of them came from that one tiny little place off the coast of Reykjavik. I don't know anything like it in all of immigration studies that I've done in any part globally. It's just absolutely fascinating. President Bjrnsen and many other saints gathered for the opening of a permanent exhibit at the same time up in Hofsós. This exhibit now has been transferred down to Reykjavik this year as part of the sesquicentennial. My wife and I just got back from having a wonderful experience there, and I had the opportunity of speaking to the Icelandic people in the Culture House that's in downtown Reykjavik. There's a wall of honor that was in Hofsós, now is in Reykjavik, showing the images of these people that came to Utah. Bryn Heyman and David Ashby were involved in this program to be able to get these monuments and things going, and were aided by Bliss Anderson, who's a Spanish Fork local gal who has done so much in building the kingdom and helping them. Now remember, the gospel came in 1851 to Iceland, but it would take nearly 150 years before the first chapel would be dedicated. This is a very special time, on the 4th of July of 2000. This is Unar's father, who I dearly love, Olafur, that's here with President Bjrnsen. I don't know of any other time that a president of a country has visited the dedication of an LDS chapel. But here he was with Elder Kerr, and anyway, a marvelous stirring of the Spirit there among the people in the fire on ice. Icelandic converts, though, today are encouraged to remain in their homeland and build Zion in their own countries. We have, though, many of the descendants here that have come from those early years. They're involved in the Regional Family History Center at Spanish Fork, and they were heavily involved in the celebration in June that occurred when President Gordon B. Hinckley came and spoke, and also President Bjrnsen. Together they spoke from the same stand in June. And we had, get this, we had a choir of non-LDS Icelandic saints that paid their own way. Okay, this is a lot of money just for the airfare. They paid their own way to pay tribute to their Icelandic brothers and sisters, although from another faith. Perhaps they were saying in their hearts, in the essentials let there be unity, in the non-essentials liberty, but in all things charity. What a wonderful, touching thing for us to behold. Here's the monument here with their names. This was built in 1938. It was refurbished. We have these different monuments here in Spanish Fork that have gone on. And so this year, as we celebrate this wonderful sesquicentennial event, I want to just conclude by saying that the story of Icelandic Latter-day Saints reminds us that there is a supreme being who is a father to all of mankind, and that he surely does remember those who are upon the isles of the sea. Thank you.